A single dad gives his only coat to a freezing woman on a snowy night by morning. A black limo is waiting outside his door with a message that could change everything. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The wind cut through Ethan Cole's threadbare jacket as he stepped off the last bus, grocery bag clutched tightly to his chest. Snow was falling in slow, quiet flakes, dusting the sidewalks of Maple Hill in a fresh coat of white, softening the town's wear and tear. The street lamps glowed dimly through the flurries, casting hazy halos of gold that blurred the lines between reality and dream. He shifted the bag in his arms, careful not to crush the loaf of bread or the single bruised apple he'd promised Sophie. It wasn't much, just enough for soup and toast. Just enough to get them through one more night. Ethan's boots crunched over packed snow, the sound steady and familiar, even comforting. The streets were mostly empty, too cold for lingering, and the whole town seemed to be holding its breath beneath the weight of winter. He tugged his scarf higher, more instinct than warmth, and quickened his pace. Sophie hated when he was late. She didn't say it outright, she never did, but he could see it in her face. In the way she stood at the window waiting, her little hands pressed to the glass. Their apartment building came into view, small and tired, tucked between two boarded-up shops that hadn't seen business since before the pandemic. A warm square of yellow light glowed from their second-floor window. Sophie was home, safe, probably reading the same book for the 50th time or drawing another picture of the two of them, stick-figured and smiling. He smiled despite the cold, despite the ache in his shoulders, and the too tight squeeze of his budget. Because she was waiting. Because that light meant everything. As he climbed the stairs, a gust of wind pulled at the brown paper bag, threatening to tear it. He held it tighter, whispering a half-laugh. Not today. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon and crayon wax. Sophie looked up from the floor, where she'd been coloring by the heater, and beamed. "Hi, Daddy." "Hey, sunshine," he said, setting down the bag. "I brought the bread, and guess what? I found your favorite kind of soup." Her eyes lit up. "Tomato and stars?" "Tomato and stars," he confirmed, crouching beside her as snow kept falling quietly outside. The wind was mean that night, sharp, unrelenting, the kind of cold that settled into your bones and stayed there. Ethan hunched his shoulders against it, his breath rising in plumes as he crossed Maple Hill's Main Street, the grocery bag now empty and tucked beneath his arm. He dropped dinner off for Mrs. Carson, widowed and half-blind, but still convinced she didn't need anyone's help. Ethan didn't argue. He just left a meal at her door and moved on. Most of the storefronts were dark, windows fogged and locked up tight. Only the pharmacy glowed faintly down the block, the light flickering through the storm like a candle on its last breath. He was nearly home when he saw her. At first, he thought she might be a shadow. Just a figure, blurred by snow and darkness, huddled beneath the bus stop shelter like part of the bench itself. But as he got closer, he saw the tremble in her shoulders. The way her arms were wrapped tightly around her middle. A woman young, but not quite fragile, wearing a coat far too thin for a night like this. She didn't look up as he approached. Just stared down at the sidewalk, eyes glassy and red-rimmed, like maybe she'd been crying or hadn't slept in a while. Or both. "You waiting for the bus?" Ethan asked gently, slowing his steps. She glanced up, startled. Her eyes were striking clear and dark, a kind of steel that tried to look unbothered but failed under the weight of exhaustion. "I was," she said. "It's not coming." He nodded, glancing down the street. No buses would be running in this weather, not this late. "You got somewhere to go?" Silence, then a pause. "I'll figure it out." Ethan hesitated. He didn't know her story, or why she was out here alone. But something about her maybe, the way she sat so still, too proud to ask for help but too lost to leave, pulled at him. Without a word, he shrugged off his coat and draped it around her shoulders. It was old, patched at the elbows, too big for her by far. But it was warm. She looked up at him, confused. "What are you doing?" "Just "Stay warm," he said quietly. And then he turned, disappearing back into the storm. The snow picked up around him, swirling like whispered warnings through the narrow alley between the hardware store and the diner. Ethan didn't look back. His coethus only real winter coat was gone, left behind on the shoulders of a stranger with haunted eyes. His arms ached from the cold now, exposed through the threadbare flannel he wore underneath, but he kept walking. Each step was heavier than the last, not from the weight of regret, but from the quiet nag of uncertainty. Maybe he should have stayed. Asked if she needed a ride, a phone call, something. But then again, he'd learned long ago that most people didn't want rescuing. They wanted distance, dignity. She hadn't asked for anything, and he hadn't needed her to. The old scar on his knuckle burned as he rubbed his hands together, chasing warmth that wouldn't come. That coat had been a gift from his brother years ago. Canvas-lined, fleece interior, tough enough to survive 4 winters and 2 busted radiators. It was the kind of coat a man wore when he didn't have much else to protect him. But tonight it had protected someone else. That felt like enough. His boots slipped once on a patch of black ice near the corner of Elm and 5th. He caught himself with a grunt, straightened, and pushed forward. The apartment wasn't far now. Light spilled from behind their curtains. Sophie must have turned on the lamp he always told her to save for emergencies. She was probably curled up with her blanket and that stuffed rabbit missing an ear, pretending not to worry. As he stepped inside, a wave of heat from the space heater brushed against his numb skin. Sophie rushed over, frowning the way only a child who's seen too much does. "Daddy, where's your coat?" He peeled off his wet flannel and offered a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Someone needed it more. She blinked, then nodded solemnly, as if she understood more than he'd expected. That night, while Sophie slept curled against his side, Ethan stared at the ceiling, wondering if he'd ever see that woman again. He didn't expect that he already had. The door creaked softly behind Ethan as he stepped inside, careful not to let the cold air linger. The heater in the corner rattled as it pushed out a weak, uneven stream of warmth that barely reached the far wall. Still, it was something. He stomped the snow from his boots, teeth clenched to keep them from chattering, and tried not to wince as the warmth of the room began to sting his frozen fingers. Sophie looked up from the couch, where she'd made a nest of blankets and stuffed animals. The TV was playing quietly, some old cartoon rerun she'd seen 100 times. She was small for 7, but her eyes were sharp, always watching more than she let on. "You're soaked," she said, pushing the blanket off her lap and standing. "Just a little wet?" Ethan replied quickly, peeling off his flannel shirt and tossing it over the chair. His undershirt clung to his skin, damp and cold. "Storm's picking up out there." Sophie frowned. "But your coat." "Had to take it off. Got too hot walking," he lied. "Badly." She didn't say anything for a second, just looked at him with those big, knowing eyes. Then she turned and walked into the kitchen, standing on tiptoe to reach the cupboard. Moments later, she returned with a chipped mug and the last of the cocoa mix, pouring hot water from the kettle he'd left on the stove before he went out. Ethan sat on the edge of the couch, rubbing his hands together. Sophie handed him the mug. "Thanks, sweetheart." "You should have worn your coat," she said quietly, sitting beside him. "I know." They drank in silence. The storm, tapping against the windows like an uninvited guest. The radiator hummed weakly in the background. Sophie leaned her head against his arm. "Who'd you give it to?" He didn't answer right away. "Someone who needed it." Sophie was quiet again, but he felt her small fingers curl around his. She didn't push. She never did. Outside, the wind howled louder. But in that tiny apartment, wrapped in hand-me-down blankets and soft silences, Ethan held on to the little warmth he had left and the one person who made all of it worth it. The city skyline shimmered beyond the tall windows, blurred by snow and glass. In her penthouse suite, Camille Whitmore sat curled in a velvet armchair near the fireplace, legs tucked beneath her, and a steaming cup of tea forgotten on the end table. The room around her was all quiet, luxury-polished wood floors, marble accents, golden lamp glow, a place built for comfort. But tonight, it felt colder than the streets she'd escaped. His coat was too big, faded olive green, the hem frayed, one pocket stitched with mismatched thread. It smelled faintly of motor oil and pine, with something warmer underneath like firewood or clean sweat. It clung to her shoulders like a memory. She pulled it tighter, her fingers brushing the rough lining. Her thoughts tangled in the storm that hadn't yet passed. Camille had grown up with the kind of wealth that silenced questions. Cars waiting before she stepped outside. Chauffeurs trained to smile but never speak. Every detail of her life planned, polished, presented. And yet tonight, when her driver had dropped her off blocks too early by mistake and her phone had died and the cold had clawed through her coat like glass, she hadn't been prepared. Not for him. He hadn't asked for a name. Hadn't checked for a camera or a phone or even recognition. Just saw her shaking and handed over the one thing keeping him warm. Then disappeared into the snow like it didn't matter. Like kindness didn't cost anything. But it had cost him. She'd seen it. The way his shoulders hunched. The way his jaw tightened. He was cold, and he still gave it away. Camille stared at the fire. The coat felt heavier now. Not because of its weight, but because of what it meant. Real people didn't do that anymore. Not in her world. Not in the boardrooms and investor meetings. Not in the million-dollar penthouses and hotel suites where warmth came pre-installed. She looked down at the coat again, brushing her fingers along a torn seam near the collar. "Who are you?" she thought, "and why can't I stop thinking about you?" The morning air was brittle and sharp, the kind that made every breath sting and each step crunch beneath a crust of half-melted snow. Ethan stood by the stove, flipping pancakes for Sophie with one hand while cradling a mug of cheap instant coffee in the other. The apartment still smelled faintly of damp clothes and cocoa from the night before, but now it was laced with something sweeter vanilla syrup Sophie had insisted on adding to the batter. He was just about to call her to the table when a low rumble broke the stillness outside. Not the usual clank of the city bus or the sputtering engine of their neighbor's old pickup. This was smooth, polished. Controlled. Ethan moved to the window, brushing aside the fogged glass with the sleeve of his flannel. A black limousine idled at the curb, sleek and shining like it had no business being anywhere near his building. The kind of car that belonged in magazines, not next to crumbling brick and slush-covered sidewalks. The front passenger door opened, and a man stepped out. Tall, well-dressed, wearing gloves that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly rent. He walked up to the building, checking a note in his hand, and then climbed the stairs. Ethan turned just as the knock came 3 sharp taps on the door, not rushed, not hesitant. Sophie peeked out from the kitchen. "Are we expecting someone?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "No. Stay here." Ethan opened the door a crack. The man nodded politely and extended an envelope, thick cream paper with his name handwritten across the front. "Mr. Cole?" Ethan nodded. "She'd like to see you." He blinked. "Who?" The man offered a small smile. "The woman from last night." Before Ethan could respond, the man turned and descended the steps, leaving the envelope in Ethan's hand and the limo engine still humming below. Ethan stared after him. Heart ticking faster now. He hadn't told her his name. Hadn't expected to see her again, but apparently she had. Ethan sat stiffly on the leather seat, hands folded in his lap, like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. The inside of the limo was absurdly quiet, the kind of silence that made him too aware of every breath he took, every scuff on his worn work boots. Outside, the city blurred by snow flurries drifting past the tinted windows as if they belonged to a different world entirely. He wasn't sure why he'd said yes. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else, something about the way her eyes had looked last night, like they were carrying the kind of weight he recognized. The driver hadn't offered much, just a polite, "Miss Whitmore is expecting you," followed by a nod toward the open door. Sophie had clung to his side when he left, her little arms wrapped around his waist like she didn't want him stepping into something that didn't belong to them. He'd promised he'd be back before dinner. Now, As the limo glided through the gates of an upscale hotel he'd only ever seen lit up at Christmas, Ethan tried not to fidget. Chandeliers glowed behind frosted windows. Valets moved like clockwork. A doorman opened the car door before it had even fully stopped. Ethan stepped out slowly, the cold brushing his face like a question. His flannel shirt looked painfully out of place next to the polished marble steps and designer coats sweeping past him. Inside, the lobby was all gold and glass and echoing footsteps. People moved with the ease of wealth, as if this kind of luxury was stitched into their skin. A concierge greeted him with a tight smile and motioned toward the elevator. "Top floor, sir. Miss Whitmore is waiting." Ethan nodded, swallowing down the part of him that wanted to turn back, to slip out the revolving door and return to the quiet, familiar rhythm of scraped knuckles and engine grease. But the elevator opened with a soft chime, and he stepped inside. As the floors ticked upward, so did the knot in his stomach. What the hell was he doing here? And why did it feel like something in his life had just shifted for good? The elevator doors slid open with a soft hush, revealing a private hallway wrapped in quiet opulence. The carpet beneath Ethan's boots was thick enough to muffle even his hesitant steps, and the sconces lining the walls gave off a soft, golden, glow-like candlelight, but cooler somehow. Ahead, a single door stood slightly ajar. He hesitated. Then it opened the rest of the way. Camille stood there, framed by the doorway, like she belonged to some other world entirely. She wasn't wrapped in luxury, now no fur coat or dripping jewels. Just a soft navy sweater, her hair loose over her shoulders, bare feet tucked beneath linen slacks. And yet she still looked like she'd stepped off a magazine cover. Her eyes lit up when she saw him. "You came." Ethan nodded, adjusting the sleeves of his flannel automatically. "Wasn't sure if I should." "I'm glad you did," she said, stepping aside and motioning him in. The suite was open and warm, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the snow-dusted skyline. A fire crackled in the corner, and his Cothis coat still hung over the back of a chair. "I was going to have it cleaned," Camille said, catching his gaze. "But then I thought, maybe you wouldn't want it touched." Ethan looked at her, brow raised. "You brought me all the way here? For a coat?" "No," she said, and her voice softened. "I brought you here because I needed to say thank you, properly." He shifted, uncertain. "You could have done that with a note." "I could have," she agreed, studying him. "But I didn't want to." There was a pausion of those quiet moments that didn't feel awkward, just heavy with things not yet said. "I owe you something," she said, stepping closer. "For what you did. For giving me your coat without asking for a thing. That doesn't happen in my world." Ethan shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." Her eyes narrowed slightly, not cold, just curious. "Why did you do it?" He shrugged. "You looked cold." That was enough. Camille smiled then. Something soft, genuine. "Well, I'm not great at letting things go unbalanced. So please, let me repay you. Anything." Ethan met her eyes, steady now. "I don't want money." She tilted her head, intrigued. "Then, what do you want?" He didn't answer right away. Because, truthfully, he wasn't sure anymore. Camille stood near the fire, arms loosely crossed, watching him the way someone might study a language they'd never had to learn, curious, cautious, wanting to understand without breaking it. Ethan stayed by the window, hands shoved in his pockets, the city glittering behind him like a distant universe. She moved first, walking to the sleek bar cart and pouring 2 glasses of water, not wine, not champagne, just something simple, thoughtful. She handed him one, and he took it with a quiet nod. "I did a little asking around," she began. "About you." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That supposed to impress me or scare me?" "Neither," Camille said, smiling faintly. "Just wanted to know who gave me his only coat in the middle of a blizzard and walked away like it was nothing." He took a sip of water, staying silent. "You run a repair bay part-time. You freelance odd jobs. You've got a little girl, Sophie, right?" His shoulders tensed. "You looked into my daughter?" "I asked one question," she said quickly. "Just her name. That's all." Ethan didn't answer, but something in his jaw unclenched. Camille set her glass down, tone softening. I have a collection of classic cars, a few rare models that need work. And I need a part-time driver, someone I can trust to show up when things matter. Someone real, reliable. He stared at her. You want me to be your mechanic? And driver, she added. Flexible schedule, benefits, a 6-figure salary. He blinked. Excuse me? Camille smiled gently. I told you I like to repay my debts. Ethan exhaled, slow and quiet. That's not repayment. That's charity in a tuxedo. It's an opportunity, she said. One you earned. But he was already shaking his head. I don't live in your world. I fix cars. I get my hands dirty. I don't wear suits or drive people to galas. Maybe that's why I need you, she said softly. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Not angry, not offended, just tired. Thanks, but I'm not for hire. He turned toward the door. And I'm not a debt you owe. Then, without waiting for her to respond, he stepped out, leaving warmth, wealth, and wonder behind. The wind had calmed by morning, leaving a brittle hush over Maple Hill. Icicles clung to the eaves like sharp little reminders that winter wasn't letting go anytime soon. Ethan stood outside the garage, key in hand, breath curling into the cold. The old metal door creaked as it rolled open, the familiar scent of oil, rubber, and rust settling over him like a worn blanket. Back to normal. The tools were right where he'd left them. Socket wrenches, a torque gun, the coffee mug with chipped enamel that read "Best Dad Ever" in Sophie's handwriting. The world hadn't shifted here. Nothing glittered. Nothing whispered of marble floors or 6-figure offers wrapped in silk. He rubbed his hands together, more from habit than chill, and started the space heater in the corner. It sputtered to life with its usual groan. He didn't need fancy. He needed reliable. But as he laid out the parts for an alternator replacement, his mind kept drifting. Not to the offer, but to her. Camille. That look in her eyes when he turned her down, part disbelief, part something else. Respect, maybe? Or confusion? He didn't know. He tightened a bolt too hard and cursed under his breath, reaching for a rag. This wasn't who he was. Not someone who got distracted by a pair of expensive eyes and a voice that sounded like it belonged in a boardroom, not beside a fire. He'd made the right choice. He had to believe that. A soft buzz from his phone broke the silence. A message from Sophie's school. A reminder about tomorrow's winter fundraiser. He sighed, doing quick math in his head. There wasn't much left after rent, groceries, and the overdue electric bill. Maybe he could pick up another job over the weekend, something quick, under the table. He set the phone down and looked around the garage. It was cracked and dusty and cold. But it was his. Just like Sophie. Just like the life he'd built, one busted engine at a time. Still, somewhere in the back of his mind, warmth lingered. A firelit room. A coat on a chair. And a question he couldn't quite stop hearing. What do you want? He hadn't answered. Because maybe he still didn't know. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the living room floor, golden light slipping through the blinds in soft stripes. Sophie sat cross-legged on the worn rug, sorting through her colored pencils with the kind of focus only a 7-year-old could summon. Ethan was at the sink, rinsing off 2 chipped dinner plates and trying not to think about black limousines or penthouse views. Sophie broke the silence without looking up. Daddy? Yeah, kiddo? Was that a limo outside this morning? He stilled for a beat, water running over his hands as he stared out the window. The snow was already beginning to melt, pooling into slush along the curb. Yeah, he said finally. It was. She turned toward him now, eyes wide with curiosity. Why did it come here? Who was it for? Ethan dried his hands slowly. Me. Her brow furrowed, lips twisting as she tried to make sense of it. You? Did someone rich need their car fixed? He chuckled under his breath, setting the towel aside. Not exactly. Sophie waited, her silence louder than any question. She had his patience, but not his forgetfulness. She wouldn't let it go. Ethan sighed, and dropped into the armchair across from her. Remember the woman we saw at the bus stop? The one who looked cold? Sophie nodded. You gave her your coat." "Right," he said. "Turns out she wanted to thank me. Sent that limo to invite me somewhere fancy." Sophie's eyes grew round. "Did you go?" "I did." She blinked. "Was it like a castle?" "Kind of," he said, smiling. "Tall windows, big fireplace, soft rugs. Too nice for someone like me." Sophie tilted her head. "Did she give you your coat back?" "Not yet," he said. "But I think she will." There was a long pause before she spoke again. "Are you going to see her again?" Ethan looked away, toward the soft glow spilling through the window. "I don't know." Sophie nodded slowly, thoughtful. Then, with all the seriousness a child could muster, she said, "Well, I think she's your friend." "You don't have many friends, Daddy." He smiled, quietly wounded and quietly grateful. "Maybe you're right." And for the first time all day, the question that had been gnawing at him didn't feel quite so heavy. The garage was humming with the low, steady rhythm of a day half gone. Ethan had grease on his knuckles, sweat on his brow, and the hood of an old Corolla propped open like the jaws of a tired beast. Outside, the snow was finally giving Maple Hill a break. Sun slipping through scattered clouds and glinting off puddles that hadn't yet frozen over again. He was midway through tightening a bolt when he heard it a smooth purr. Not the usual rattle and wheeze of the neighborhood crowd. It was unmistakable. The sound of something expensive. Something rare. He wiped his hands on a rag, brow furrowed, and stepped out to the bay entrance just as the car pulled up. A cherry-red 1967 Mustang convertible, looking like it belonged more on a showroom floor than on the cracked concrete of his lot, and behind the wheel Camille. She stepped out slowly, deliberately, wearing jeans this time, a wool coat, and boots with only the faintest hint of polish. Her hair was tied back in a low ponytail, sunglasses perched in her hand rather than on her face. And that look calm, collected, and yet somehow just a little unsure met his across the space between them. "Well," he said, tossing the rag onto the tool cart. "Didn't think I'd be seeing you here." Camille glanced at the car like it had betrayed her. It started making a strange noise about 10 minutes outside town. Then it began to stutter. And, "Here I am." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You just happened to break down in front of my garage?" Her smile was slow, amused. Maple Hill isn't exactly known for its abundance of classic car specialists. He gave a dry chuckle, walking over to pop the hood. "You know I told you no, right?" "Yes," she said softly. "You did. And yet—" "I'm not here about the job," she interrupted gently. "I'm here about the car." Ethan looked at her, half skeptical, half something else. She wasn't wearing a mask today. No polished poise. No rehearsed lines. Just a woman with a busted engine and maybe more than one reason to be standing in front of him. "All right," he said, reaching for his wrench. "Let's see what we're dealing with." She smiled. "I thought you might say that." The Mustang's hood was propped open, its gleaming engine exposed beneath the muted light filtering through the garage windows. Ethan worked with practiced focus, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, hands steady, even as the air between him and Camille thickened with the kind of quiet that wasn't quite awkward, just expectant. Camille leaned against the workbench a few feet away, arms loosely crossed, her eyes not on the car, but on him. She didn't speak right away, just watched. Noticing the small things most people miss, the way he checked each bolt twice, the way he wiped his hands before touching the chrome, like he respected the machine more than the paycheck. "You do this every day?" she asked, finally, breaking the silence. He glanced at her over the engine block. "Fix things? Yeah?" "No," she said with a faint smile. "Work this hard, care this much." He gave a small shrug, tightening a valve. "Cars don't lie. They either run or they don't. There's something honest about that." Camille nodded, thoughtful. "And your daughter? Sophie, right?" His hands paused, just for a second, before he reached for the next tool. "Yeah, Sophie. She seems special," Camille added. "Bright, kind." "She is," Ethan said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Too smart for her own good sometimes. Camille tilted her head. Her mom? He didn't answer right away, just kept working, slower now. She passed, he said finally, voice low, but even. When Sophie was 3. I'm sorry. He nodded once, as if he'd grown used to saying thank you to that kind of apology. Must be hard, she added gently. Doing it all alone. Ethan looked up, meeting her gaze directly for the first time. It is, but I don't mind hard. I mind not trying. Something shifted then. Camille's expression softened, the poise she wore like a second skin falling just slightly. You know, she said, voice quieter now, it's strange. What is? I've been surrounded by people with everything. Money, power, influence, but not one of them ever said something like that. Ethan gave a small, dry smile and returned to the engine. Maybe they've never had anything real to lose. And for a long moment, neither of them said anything. But something had changed. Not the car. Not the job. Something in the air between two people with different lives and hearts that, somehow, didn't feel so different at all. The Mustang's engine gave a soft hum as Ethan turned the key, letting it idle just enough to test the adjustments. He leaned in, listening with the kind of patience only years of late-night repairs and second-hand parts could teach. Satisfied, he cut the ignition and wiped his hands clean. Camille was still there, sitting on the wooden bench near the wall, sipping a cup of the bad coffee he'd offered with a quiet smile and a soft, "Thank you." She hadn't said much since he'd finished the main repairs, just watched, listened, like she was waiting for the right moment to speak. She set the cup down now, fingers lacing loosely in her lap. You asked me why I was out in the storm that night. Ethan nodded, pulling up a stool beside the bench. Didn't think it was my place. I didn't want to go where I was supposed to be. Her voice was calm, but something about it had changed, like the floor under it had shifted. I was supposed to be at a dinner. Big table, white linens, more forks than I'll ever need. Surrounded by people who talk a lot but say very little. He waited, giving her space. My marriage ended 2 years ago, she continued. He was a good man in paper, wealthy, well-connected. Everyone said it made sense. I think I married the version of him that looked right in magazines. She paused, looking down at her hands. My father ran the company before me. I never saw him much. He used to say, success was measured in numbers, not time, not people. I grew up in a mansion where the walls echoed because no one really lived in it, just existed. Ethan said nothing, just listened. I've spent most of my life surrounded by everything money can buy, Camille said, her voice almost a whisper now. But I've never really known what it feels like to be chosen by someone who didn't have anything to gain. She glanced at him then, her eyes steady and unguarded. You didn't know who I was. You didn't care. And still, you gave me your coat. Ethan held her gaze. Didn't need to know your name to see you were freezing? A soft smile touched her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. Not yet. For the first time since she'd stepped into his world, Camille looked less like a woman with everything and more like someone who had spent too long looking for something she never learned how to name. The bell over the diner door jingled with that familiar little chime as Ethan held it. Open for Camille, the scent of fried potatoes and warm syrup immediately wrapping around them like a blanket. The place was small worn leather booths, checkered tile floors, and a jukebox in the corner that hadn't played a new song since the early 90s, but it was the kind of spot where names were remembered and coffee never ran out. Camille stepped inside slowly, taking it in with the quiet curiosity of someone entering a foreign country without a map. You sure this is okay? She asked, glancing at the laminated menu taped to the window. Ethan gave her a sideways smile. It's where we eat when it's a good week, and sometimes, even when it's not. They slid into a booth near the window, the vinyl seat squeaking softly beneath them. Sophie was already there, perched on her knees and coloring the paper placemat with a red crayon she'd pulled from her backpack. She looked up when Camille sat down across from her, eyes wide with polite curiosity. You're the lady from the coat night, Sophie said, matter of fact. Ethan winced. Sophie, Camille smiled. I am. And you must be the boss. Sophie giggled. I kind of am. They ordered burgers and milkshakes, pancakes for Sophie because, as she explained, pancakes don't have a time of day. Camille listened intently, nodding along as Sophie rattled off her current favorite books and how she'd almost beaten Ethan at chess last night. Ethan watched the two of them, a strange warmth stirring in his chest. Camille didn't seem out of place, here not exactly. But there was a moment, just a flicker, when she held the thick ceramic mug of coffee in both hands like it was something precious. Like she didn't drink from mugs like that very often. Or ever. When the check came, Camille reached for it instinctively. Ethan caught her hand gently, shaking his head. Tonight's on me, he said. You're our guest. She hesitated, then nodded with a soft smile. Okay, but next time, it's mine. Next time. He felt the words settle somewhere deep, quiet, and unexpected, and as Sophie leaned her head on his shoulder, giggling at one of Camille's dry, understated jokes, Ethan wondered when the last time was that dinner had felt this easy, this warm, this full. The snow came in fast, like it had been waiting for the perfect moment to slip in unnoticed. By the time Ethan pulled the truck into the parking lot outside their apartment, the wind was already tossing flakes sideways, coating the windshield in a thin blur of white. He glanced at Camille in the passenger seat, then back at Sophie in the rearview mirror. Looks like we're getting another round, he said. You okay hanging around a little longer? Camille looked out at the swirling snow, then back at him. I think I can manage. Inside the apartment, Sophie kicked off her boots and immediately went for the couch, wrapping herself in her favorite quilt with the tattered sunflowers. Camille stood just inside the door, fingers brushing the edge of the hallway wall as if trying to feel her way into a life that wasn't hers. Ethan tossed another log onto the fire and stoked it until the flames crackled bright and steady. The room filled with that cozy scent of wood smoke and old pine, and for a moment it felt like winter belonged to them and no one else. Hot cocoa? He asked, heading for the kitchen. Please, Camille replied, unzipping her coat and draping it gently over the back of the chair. They gathered near the fire, Sophie stretched out with her coloring book, Ethan sitting on the floor with his back against the couch, and Camille curled up in the armchair, a mug cradled in her hands like it was something fragile. At first, the conversation was light stories about Sophie's school, the latest book she was reading, how Ethan once tried to fix a toaster and accidentally welded it shut. Camille laughed. Really laughed, the kind that softened her eyes and made her seem younger, like someone untouched by boardrooms and expectations. Then came the quieter stories. Camille spoke about boarding school winters and holidays spent with staff instead of family. Ethan told her about Sophie's first Christmas after her mother passed, how they made gifts out of cardboard and glitter glue and still kept one on the shelf. No one said the word lonely, but it hung between them, understood without needing to be named. Outside, the snow thickened. Inside, the fire popped and sighed, a steady rhythm in the hush of unspoken things. And for one night, none of them were strangers. The next morning dawned pale and cold, the kind of stillness that came after a hard snow. Maple Hill looked like a snow globe, quiet, soft-edged, every rooftop lined in white. Ethan stepped out of the apartment to scrape ice from the truck windshield, Sophie still inside brushing her teeth with sleepy determination. He was halfway through clearing the driver's side window when his phone buzzed in his coat pocket. He pulled it out, thumb swiping across the screen without thinking. A message from Kenny, one of the guys he occasionally worked side jobs with. Dude, is this the woman you were talking about? A link followed. Ethan tapped it. The article loaded with a photo front and Centera crisp high-resolution shot of Camille standing on the steps of some glossy gala venue, all clean lines and evening light. Her hair was styled in soft waves, a silver gown shimmering under camera flashes. She looked like someone from a world that ran parallel to his, but never touched it. Camille St. James returns to U.S. After Europe expansion, Whitmore, hotel heiress, making big moves in stateside markets. Ethan stared at the headline, then the byline, then the photo again. The name under it hit harder than he expected. Camille St. James. He scrolled quickly, scanning the article. Words like empire, heiress, luxury conglomerate, and net worth jumped off the screen like sparks from a live wire. He felt the cold differently now, not just on his skin, but under it. Sophie's voice called from the door. "Dad, you almost done?" "Yeah," he managed. "Just about." She disappeared back inside, and Ethan stood there a moment longer, staring at the screen, the snow falling gently around him. He thought of the night by the fire, the soft laughter, the quiet stories, the way she looked at Sophie like it meant something. He also thought about the limo, the security she never mentioned, the careful way she moved, like someone used to being watched. Camille hadn't lied, but she hadn't told the truth either. And Ethan wasn't sure which hurt more. The wrench slipped in Ethan's hand, clanging against the side of the engine with a sharp metallic crack. He cursed under his breath and sat back on his heels, pressing his thumb to the spot where the skin had split just below the nail. The sting didn't bother him much. It was the kind of pain he understood. The garage was quiet except for the ticking of the space heater and the occasional creak of the roof shifting under melting snow. But inside his head, everything was louder. Camille's name on that article, her picture in that silver dress, the word heiress flashing like a warning light he hadn't noticed before. He hadn't answered her text. He hadn't wanted to, not because he was angry, but because now everything made too much sense. The way she carried herself, the way she looked at him like she wanted something real but didn't know how to ask for it. And now that he knew, it felt like the ground had changed beneath his feet. He glanced toward the workbench where Sophie's drawings were still pinned, with magnets, crayon stick figures, crooked hearts, and one picture of a woman with shiny shoes holding hands with a girl in pigtails. Camille. Sophie had drawn Camille. That was the part that twisted the deepest. He could handle the distance between their lives, the empty bank account versus her penthouse suite, the rusted truck versus the imported Mustang. But Sophie? She was soft in all the places Ethan had worked so hard to keep safe. And if Camille disappeared, or worse, stayed just long enough to leave a mark, Sophie would feel it like a fracture she didn't have the words for. He couldn't let that happen. He pulled off his gloves and reached for his phone. Camille had messaged again. "Hope you're okay. Let me know if you want to talk." He stared at it for a long time, then set the phone down without replying. Because in a world of people like her, maybe people like him were just passing moments. And maybe that was all he could let himself be. The conference room in Midtown glowed with floor-to-ceiling windows and the faint buzz of restrained tension. Camille sat at the long glass table, flanked by advisors, consultants, and executives in tailored suits. A mock-up for the new boutique hotel line flickered on the screen behind her, but her mind wasn't in the room. Not really. It hadn't been. Not since Maple Hill. Not since Ethan. Not since Sophie. She glanced down at her phone beneath the tablano new messages. He hadn't answered in days. She told herself he just needed time, that he was thinking things through. But then the door opened, and time her past walked in uninvited, Julian Langford. He moved through the doorway like he still owned it, all confidence and custom tailoring. The kind of man who'd never had to raise his voice to command a room or destroy one. Camille's stomach turned. "Julian," she said, cool and even, though her heart thudded once, hard. "Camille," he greeted, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You weren't returning my calls." "That's not accidental." One of the legal advisors leaned toward her, whispering something about licensing in Seattle, but she didn't hear it. Her eyes stayed locked on Julian. He chuckled, settling in the seat across from her. "Relax, I'm not here to stir the pot, just to talk." "About what?" He leaned forward. "About what the press is saying, about him." Her jaw tightened. "You read gossip now?" "You're in it. Which means it affects business." Our business. There is no our anymore, Julian. He raised an eyebrow. You're right. But the board doesn't see it that way. And they're nervous. A mechanic from nowhere? With a kid? Really, Camille? She felt it then, the heat behind her ribs. Not shame. Not doubt. Fury. Careful, she said quietly. You're forgetting that I own more of this company than you ever will. Julian's smile faded. Just be smart. If you're serious about him, make sure he's not serious about you for the wrong reasons. People like him, they want something. She stood. So did you, Julian. That's why we didn't work. As he left the room, Camille's hands trembled beneath the tableau knot from fear, but from knowing exactly what was at stake. And suddenly, silence from Ethan felt heavier than ever. The invitation arrived in a pale blue envelope, hand-delivered by the same black car that had once felt like a rupture in Ethan's quiet life. It sat on his kitchen table for nearly an hour before he opened it, the paper thick and smooth beneath his calloused fingers. Gold lettering shimmered across the page. The Whitmore Foundation, Annual Gala Saturday, 7 p.m. Formal attire required. Bring someone who matters. At the bottom, scribbled in Camille's unmistakable handwriting, I'd like it to be you. Ethan stared at it for a long time, his thumb brushing the edge of the card. The apartment was quiet, save for the sound of the wall heater ticking on and Sophie humming to herself in the next room, coloring something with great concentration. He placed the invitation back on the table and reached for a towel, wiping his hands as if that would make the decision any easier. Hey, Sunshine? He called. Can I ask you something? Sophie patted in, socks mismatched, a smudge of marker on her cheek. Is it about the shiny envelope? He blinked. You saw that, huh? She nodded solemnly. I didn't open it, but it looked fancy. It's an invitation, he said, to a party. A really fancy one. Camille wants me to go with her. Sophie's eyes lit up instantly. Like a ball? Like the kind where people wear dresses and eat food that's too small? He chuckled. Something like that. Well, are you going? Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know. I don't fit in that world, Soph. It's all tuxedos and champagne, and I've got oil under my nails and boots with a tear in the sole. Sophie tilted her head. But she wants you to go. Not some guy with shiny shoes. He paused. She likes you, Daddy, even if you don't wear tuxedos. He looked at her, her tiny hands on her hips, like she was daring him to argue. And just like that, the decision didn't feel so impossible. He reached for the envelope again, the corners of his mouth tugging upward. Guess I better figure out where to rent a suit, Sophie squealed. Can I help pick the tie? Only if it doesn't sparkle, he warned. But deep down, he didn't mind if it did. The gala shimmered like something out of a movie. Ethan stepped through the towering glass doors of the Whitmore Grand Hotel, the click of polished shoes on marble echoing beneath chandeliers that spilled golden light across a sea of tuxedos and glittering gowns. He tugged at the collar of the rented tux. It itched in all the wrong places. The bow tie sat too tight, and his shoes felt like they'd been built for torture, not walking. He felt like a pretender, a mechanic dropped into a masquerade he didn't belong in, trying not to wrinkle the one thing he couldn't afford to damage. But then he saw her. Camille stood across the room near the grand staircase, surrounded by people in conversation, but untouched by them all. Her gown was deep emerald, sleek and simple, but it caught the light like silk woven from shadows. Her hair was swept back, delicate earrings catching the flicker of chandelier crystals, but none of that was what made Ethan stop in his tracks. It was the way she looked at him. The moment she saw him, the conversations around her dimmed. Her expression shifted, brightened. A soft, genuine smile formed as she stepped away from the crowd, like none of them mattered. Not one billionaire or politician or socialite holding champagne flutes or checking headlines on their phones. Only him. Ethan forgot the shoes, the tux, the fact that he'd shaved twice just to make sure he looked halfway presentable. He stood still as she crossed the ballroom, her heels barely making a sound on the marble, her eyes locked on his like this whole evening, this whole world, had been waiting just for this. "You came," she said, her voice warm and a little breathless. "I told Sophie I'd try not to embarrass her," he replied, his voice lower than usual, like the room demanded reverence. "Also, you said formal. This was the only tie without grease on it." She laughed softly, stepping close enough to straighten the crooked bow-tie. "You look—" Her fingers paused at his collar. "Perfect." He swallowed, caught somewhere between disbelief and something dangerously close to awe. "I still don't belong here," he murmured. Camille leaned in, her voice near his ear. "Maybe not, but I do, and I want you here with me." And for the first time that night, Ethan let himself believe it might just be true. The rooftop was quiet, far above the clinking glasses and chamber music drifting from the ballroom below. The city stretched out in every direction, its lights twinkling like stars that had fallen and made peace with gravity. A soft wind tugged at Camille's gown, lifting the hem just enough to make her shiver. Ethan shrugged off his tuxedo jacket and offered it wordlessly. She hesitated then, smiled and slipped it over her shoulders. The sleeves were too long. She didn't seem to care. They stood side by side near the edge, hands resting on the stone railing, the hum of traffic far below, like a heartbeat too distant to reach them. For a long while, neither spoke. There was no need. "I don't understand this world," Ethan said finally, his voice low. "I fix broken things. That's what I do. I don't blend into spaces like this." Camille turned to look at him. "You don't have to blend in, Ethan. You're not wallpaper." He huffed a soft laugh, eyes still on the skyline. "People in there looked at me like I wandered in through the service entrance." "They don't know you," she said gently. "They don't need to." "I want them to." That made him turn. Her eyes caught the glow of the rooftop lights, deep and steady. No pretense, no performance. "You're different up here," he murmured. "So are you." There was a pauseful and electric. Like the city itself had leaned in. Camille stepped closer, the space between them shrinking to almost nothing. "You made me feel safe," she said. "That night. No one's ever done that without expecting something back." "I didn't want anything," he said, and she nodded, like that was exactly what mattered most. Then, slowly, like the world itself had tilted toward it, she leaned in, her lips brushed his soft. "Sure." And nothing like the chaos their lives were built from. The kiss was quiet. Not rushed, not searching, just real. When they pulled apart, the air felt changed. Charged. Ethan exhaled, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Well," he said softly, "so much for staying out of your world." Camille smiled back, eyes glowing. "I think we just built our own." The morning air was heavy with silence. Ethan stood at the counter, fingers curled around a chipped mug of black coffee, staring at the newspaper that had been shoved through the slot in the garage door. He hadn't subscribed to anything, but it was there, folded neatly, as if someone wanted to make sure he saw it. Whitmore Hyras spotted with "Mystery Mechanic Secret Romance" or "Slick Opportunist." His face was printed right there on the cover. Grainy but unmistakable, taken from the gala, his hand on Camille's waist as she smiled up at him beneath the glittering lights. The photo was too beautiful to belong to something so cruel. The article beneath it didn't pull punches. "Small-town grease monkey. Single father with a tragic past. Playing the long game?" Sources say Camille has a habit of falling for projects. Each word scraped something raw inside him. He flipped the paper over like it might silence the ringing in his ears, but it was too late. The damage had already slipped under his skin. Ethan walked to the door and opened it just as Kenny, one of the local regulars, was climbing out of his truck. Kenny raised his eyebrows and gave a low whistle. "So it's true, huh? You and the hotel queen?" Ethan didn't answer. Kenny shrugged. "Look, man, you do you. Just don't forget who you are." Ethan didn't say what he was really thinking, that he hadn't forgotten. That maybe that was the problem. Back at the apartment, Sophie was sitting cross-legged on the couch, humming to herself as she drew stars in a notebook. Her innocence made the knot in Ethan's chest tighten. Because now the world had its eyes on them, and people like Camille lived in glass towers while people like him didn't have walls thick enough to keep the noise out. His phone buzzed. Camille's name lit up the screen. He didn't answer. Not because he was angry, but because he was scared. Not for himself. For Sophie. For the day she might ask why someone like her dad was never really invited to stay. Ethan didn't go into the garage that morning. The tools stayed hung on their hooks, the lights off, the door locked. Instead, he spent the day at home, pacing between the kitchen and the window, watching snow gather along the sidewalk like time he couldn't slow down. Sophie played quietly in the living room, her usual questions strangely absent, as if she could sense the storm inside him. The paper still sat on the kitchen counter, folded now, but not forgotten. Its weight hung in the room like another presence loud, accusing, full of things Ethan never asked for. He hadn't spoken to Camille since the article hit. He hadn't answered her calls, hadn't replied to her texts. What could he say? That he was fine? That this didn't cut deeper than it should? He didn't blame her, not really. But he couldn't help but feel like the world around her had swallowed him whole and spat him out with a label, Gold Digger, Project. Plot twist. And worst of all, not enough. He looked over at Sophie, curled up with her book on the couch, her purple socks mismatched, one of her pigtails lopsided. She hadn't asked about Camille since the article. Not once. And that silence was louder than anything. He walked over and sat beside her. "You okay, Bug?" he asked, voice soft. She nodded. "Yeah." But she didn't look up from the page. Ethan hesitated. "You miss her?" A small shrug. "A little." He nodded, his chest tightening. "It's probably better this way." Sophie looked up at him then, brow furrowed. "Why?" "Because people like her," he started, but the words stuck. How could he explain something he barely understood himself? Sometimes they live in places that don't fit with ours. Sophie didn't respond right away. Then, quietly, "I liked her." "I know," he whispered. "I did too." He leaned back, staring at the ceiling like it might offer answers, but it didn't. He was trying to protect Sophie from the noise, from the headlines, from the fallout he hadn't seen coming. But in pulling away, he wondered if he was also protecting himself from hope, from the terrifying thought that maybe, just maybe, he had finally found something real, and walked away anyway. The morning was quiet in that soft, uncertain way it sometimes was, after tension lingered too long in the air. Ethan was in the kitchen, hunched over a stack of unpaid bills with a pencil behind his ear, pretending not to notice how still the apartment had become. Sophie was at the small table in the corner, her head bent low over a sheet of lined paper, her tongue poked out slightly at the corner of her mouth, her thinking face. She'd been writing for the better part of an hour, only pausing to erase something or chew thoughtfully on the end of her pencil. Ethan didn't ask. He figured it was for school. It wasn't. When she finished, she folded the paper carefully and slipped it into one of the leftover envelopes from the drawer, the kind they used for rent checks and birthday cards they couldn't afford to send. She printed a name on the front in her neatest handwriting. Miss Camille. Ethan noticed then, brow furrowing. "What's that?" Sophie didn't look up. "A letter. To Camille?" She nodded. I wanted her to know." Ethan crouched beside her, gentle but firm. "Sophie, I don't think we should—" "I didn't tell her anything bad," she interrupted, lifting the envelope to her chest. "I just told her the truth." Ethan hesitated. "What truth?" Sophie looked at him then, really looked. "That you were happy." He blinked. She continued softly. "You laughed more when she was around, and you didn't look so tired all the time. You even smiled when you made pancakes, and you never smile before coffee." He let out a breath, but it didn't ease the knot in his chest. "I know you're scared," she said, small but sure. "But I think she was scared too. Maybe she still is." Ethan didn't say anything. He didn't have to. That afternoon, while he was changing the oil on an old Dodge in the garage, Sophie walked to the post office 3 blocks down, envelope clutched in her mittened hands. She mailed the letter herself. And miles away, in a glass tower above the city, it would land in Camille's hands, days later, crumpled slightly, edges smudged. Signed in blue ink. Please don't forget us. You made my dad smile again. Love, Sophie. The boardroom smelled like leather and money-polished wood, freshly ground espresso, and just enough tension to turn the air brittle. Camille sat at the head of the long, gleaming table, her back straight, her expression unreadable as the voices around her tangled into a low murmur of disapproval wrapped in civility. "We just think," began Martindale, the oldest board member, and the one with the most carefully rehearsed tone, "that this relationship, however brief, is distracting." Another voice chimed in. "It's not about your personal life, Camille. It's about public perception, about protecting the brand." "A mechanic?" someone muttered too quietly to be accidental. Camille said nothing at first. She smoothed her thumb along the rim of her coffee cup, feeling the heat press against her skin. She'd seen this coming the moment the headlines broke. Not because Ethan had done anything wrong, but because this world never left space for people who didn't already belong. Her lawyer cleared his throat beside her, but she didn't give him the chance to step in. "You're concerned because I fell for someone without a title, without a PR-trained smile, without a trust fund or a private plane." Silence. Camille looked around the table, meeting each face in turn. "Well," she said, "I'm not." Martin leaned forward. "Camille, no one's questioning your leadership." "Yes, you are," she interrupted, calm but sharp. "You're questioning my judgment because I finally did something human, something real." A few glances exchanged, some discomfort, some guilt. Camille stood. "I built this expansion. I negotiated our partnerships overseas. I saved this company from bleeding out during the worst economic downturn we've seen in years. And if any of you think my value hinges on whether or not I date someone who owns a wrench instead of a yacht," she picked up her folder, "then we have nothing left to talk about." She turned to leave. "Camille, don't walk away from this," Martin warned. She paused at the door, then looked back. "I'm not walking away," she said. "I'm choosing something better." Then she walked out the aisle silent, spine unshaken, leaving behind the polished glass kingdom and everything it had tried to make her believe she needed. The old garage still smelled like oil and dust, but something was different. The crooked sign that once read Cole's Auto had been replaced with new wood, carefully carved and painted in bold, elegant lettering, Maple, Maine Vintage Motors. The same address. The same cracked sidewalk. But now the windows gleamed. The rusted rolling door had been replaced with glass-paneled bays, and inside, a soft hum of jazz played through a vintage radio on the workbench. Ethan stood in the middle of the shop, stunned. The floors had been redone, sealed concrete polished to a shine, with 2 lifts installed that actually worked without needing to be kicked. Along the back wall, cabinets full of tools were lined up like soldiers, everything labeled and organized, a strange but welcome kind of luxury. In one corner, a coffee station had appeared, complete with a small table and 2 stools. He hadn't asked for that, but he knew exactly who it was for. "I thought you might hate it," Camille said, stepping beside him. He turned to her, still unsure if this was real. "You bought the place." She nodded. "Not for me, for you." Ethan looked around again, still trying to find the words. This was falling apart. "It had good bones," she said with a shrug. "Just needed someone who saw its worth." He looked at her. "That sounds familiar." Camille smiled. "You fixed 100 broken things for other people. Thought maybe someone should fix something for you." He exhaled, emotion catching low in his throat. "Camille, She stopped him with a gentle hand on his arm. "There's no debt between us, no transaction. You're not a project. You're the reason I stopped chasing things that never meant anything." Ethan swallowed hard. "I don't know how to do this. I've only ever worked with scraps. She stepped closer, voice soft. Then let's build something from the ground up, together. He nodded slowly, a smile breaking through. The garage wasn't just a workplace now. It was a beginning. A second chance, wrapped in steel and sunlight. And this time, the view wasn't just better, it was shared. The snow had started again, light and slow, dusting the sidewalks of Maple Hill like powdered sugar on a world too tired to fight it. Ethan was crouched beside the front wheel of a '68 Camaro, sleeves pushed up, fingers deep in grease and memory. The garage was warm now, tools humming with new life, but his mind wandered more than it used to. He hadn't seen Camille in nearly a week. After the garage reveal, she'd left him with keys and a smile that lingered longer than any goodbye. There had been a promise in her eyes, not one spoken, but felt. Still, the silence afterward had left him restless. The bell over the garage door jingled. He looked up from under the hood, expecting a customer. Instead, what he saw stopped him cold. She was standing just inside the doorway, snow clinging to her boots and shoulders, cheeks pink from the cold, lips curved into the smallest smile. And she was wearing his coat, the old olive green one, frayed at the cuffs, stitched near the collar. The same coat he'd given her on that frozen night, like it was nothing, and now somehow it had become everything. It swallowed her frame, sleeves too long, the shoulders slouched just right. But it looked right on her, like it had always belonged there. Ethan straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag, heart thudding like an engine that hadn't been started in years. "You kept it?" he said quietly. She brushed a snowflake from her brow. "You gave it to me. I figured you'd thrown it out. Replaced it with something warmer. Foncier." Camille stepped closer. "I did try," she smiled. "But nothing else fit." He chuckled under his breath, still half stunned. "You always make an entrance." "Only when it matters." They stood there for a moment, no city noise, no headlines, no walls between them, just snow and warmth, and a coat that had once meant survival, but now meant home. "Come on in," he said finally, voice soft. "You're freezing." Camille stepped forward, closing the distance. Not anymore. The garage was quiet, save for the gentle hum of the heater and the soft patter of snow against the windows. Camille sat on the edge of the workbench, her legs swinging slightly, still wrapped in Ethan's old coat. He stood across from her, leaning against the tool chest, arms folded, gaze steady but unreadable. For once, there was no rush, no broken engine, no looming goodbye. Just the space between them, thick with everything they hadn't said. Camille broke the silence first. "I thought you weren't going to call," Ethan exhaled slowly. "I wasn't sure I should." "Why?" He hesitated, fingers tightening slightly around his biceps. "Because I didn't want to be a mistake for you." Camille's brows lifted, her voice soft. "You really think I see you that way? I've seen how people look at you. I've read what they say. You belong in boardrooms and sky rises. I belong under hoods with grease on my hands." She stepped down from the bench, slowly crossing to him. "I've lived in a world built on power and money and polished perfection, and I've never trusted any of it." Ethan met her eyes. "But you trusted me." "I do trust you." She paused. "You're the only person who never wanted anything from me." He swallowed, his voice quieter now. "I wanted something." "What?" He looked at her, really looked. "I wanted you to stay." The words hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. Camille reached up and placed a hand over his heart. "I wanted to stay, Ethan. I just didn't know how." They stood like that, breathing in the closeness, both of them exposed in a way more terrifying than any headline. "I was scared," Ethan admitted. "So was I," she said. "What if we mess this up?" She smiled gently. "Then, we fix it. Like everything else." He chuckled softly. "I've never built anything that wasn't broken first." She leaned in, resting her forehead against his. "Then maybe we start there." And in the warm silence of that old garage, two people who'd spent their lives afraid to hope finally dared to dream out loud. The snow had stopped sometime in the night, leaving a crisp stillness in its wake. Morning light spilled through the garage's wide front windows, catching on the polished chrome of the Mustang and the glint of tools neatly arranged on the wall. It was a quiet Saturday, the kind Ethan liked best. No customers yet, just the smell of fresh coffee and the familiar buzz of Sophie's chatter filling the air. Camille had arrived just after 9, arms full of pastries from the bakery down the block, cheeks pink from the cold. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, the coat left behind this time, though Ethan swore the warmth she brought with her didn't need layers. Sophie had taken to her almost instantly again, bouncing around the garage like a whirlwind, asking questions Camille was all too happy to answer. Now, as Ethan wiped his hands and leaned back against the counter, he watched from a distance as Camille knelt beside Sophie near the coffee table in the corner. Sophie was showing her a crayon, drawing 3 stick figures, holding hands beneath a giant sun and a crooked heart. Ethan knew who they were meant to be. Camille tilted her head thoughtfully. "That's me?" Sophie nodded proudly. "Yep, that's me, you, and Daddy. I gave us all the same eyes." Camille smiled, studying the picture a little longer. Then, quietly, she turned to Sophie, her voice gentle. "Can I ask you something?" Sophie blinked. "Okay." Camille reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind the girl's ear. "How would you feel if I stuck around a while longer? Not just for visits, but for good." Sophie's eyes widened, her small mouth falling open. "You mean, like, live here?" "Not just live here," Camille said softly. "Be part of your family, if that's something you want to." Across the room, Ethan froze. The wrench he'd been holding slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor. Camille looked up at him, her expression open, fearless. Sophie turned slowly, eyes shining. "Dad, is that like asking to marry you?" Ethan's breath caught. He didn't speak. He couldn't, not yet. Because in that moment, the world shifted again, and this time, it wasn't running away. It was walking straight toward him, with open hands and a question he hadn't dared let himself hope for. Until now, the garage had never felt quieter. Ethan stood there, frozen in place, his breath shallow, eyes locked on Camille still, kneeling beside Sophie, her expression calm, unguarded, patient. Like she knew this wasn't a question she could answer for him, but one she hoped he'd answer for himself. Sophie looked between them, eyes wide with hope, hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a second, Ethan couldn't find the words. Not because he didn't know what he felt, but because, for the first time in a long time, he was afraid to believe it could be real. He thought about everything they'd been through. The coat, the firelight, the kiss, the silence, the headlines. He thought about all the things he didn't have: money, status, connections, and all the things he did. His hands, his word, his love, and both of them, Camille and Sophie. Sitting there like maybe, just maybe, they'd been waiting on him all along. He crossed the room slowly, dropping to one knee so he was eye level with both of them. Sophie's fingers gripped the hem of Camille's sleeve. Camille's eyes didn't leave his. Ethan reached for Camille's hand, calloused fingers curling gently around hers. "I don't have much," he said quietly. "No promises of easy, no mansion, no name that means anything outside this town." Camille didn't move, didn't interrupt, just listened. "But I have this shop. I have Sophie. I have a heart that's beat a little differently since the day I gave you that coat." He turned to Sophie and brushed a hand through her hair. "And I have you. The best thing I've ever done." She smiled, already knowing. He looked back to Camille. "And if you're asking what I think you are, then yeah," he exhaled. "Yes." Camille's eyes glistened, a smile blooming like sunrise. "Then I guess it's official," she whispered. Sophie squealed, throwing her arms around both of them in a tangled, laughing hug. And right there, In a garage that once held nothing but tools and long days, Ethan finally understood. Love isn't measured by what you have. It's measured by what you're willing to give away even when you're afraid. Especially then. Snow fell softly over Maple Hill, blanketing the town in quiet white. The streets were still, the air crisp and full of that hushed wonder winter sometimes brings, the kind that makes even old places feel new. Inside the garage, the lights glowed warm against the gray sky, casting a golden haze over polished tools and chrome bumpers. The sign above the door read Maple, Maine Vintage Motors, its letters now familiar, weathered just enough to feel like they belonged. Inside, laughter echoed, real, easy, and full. Ethan stood near the back, sleeves rolled up. Sophie perched on a stool beside him, her tiny hands covered in flour instead of grease. A tray of cookies rested on the workbench, their shapes more blobs than stars. But no one seemed to mind. Camille walked in from the front office, her cheeks pink from the cold, and a knit scarf wrapped around her neck. She carried 3 mugs of cocoa, the tops heavy with whipped cream, and exactly 3 marshmallows in each, Sophie's new rule. "Hot delivery," she said, grinning as she set the mugs down. Sophie cheered, hopping off the stool. "You remembered the marshmallows?" "I live in fear of forgetting," Camille replied with a wink. Ethan chuckled, wrapping an arm around her waist as she leaned in beside him. She still wore his old coat on the coldest days, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. It hung on the coat rack near the door now, right beside a new one, a smaller, sunflower-patterned jacket that belonged to Sophie. Different lives. One home. As they sipped cocoa and watched the snow fall through the wide garage windows, Ethan let the quiet settle in his chest. Not the kind of silence that felt like absence, the kind that meant peace. Belonging. A stillness earned. All of it had started with a single moment. A coat, a stranger, a storm. One act of kindness on a night when everything could have gone unnoticed. But it hadn't. And now, with a family beside him, and the snow gently falling outside, Ethan knew with everything in him this was the warmest winter he'd ever known.